ancient Africa. Before I start, I want to say that Africans, like the North American Indians, and like so many other peoples, their civilization declined. They started off with a higher level of civilization, and they lost their civilization as time went on. They declined culturally. And the big issue is what went wrong and why. We will talk about that, at least some. You can't be for sure because there are few written records. And like the North American Indians, we just talk about Africans. You don't talk about people so much as you talk about trends and places and trails and artwork, music, religion, but not about people because we just don't have a record of individuals, a record that we can rely on. Now, there is an oral history where the Africans passed down their history by word of mouth from generation to generation. A lot of this history has been lost owing to this displacement of the African peoples during the slave trading days. And due to the fact that sooner or later, inevitably, there's going to come a generation where some man who knows the history does not pass it on down, where the persons he passes it on down to die before he does. So a lot of this oral tradition is lost, but African people were expected to memorize the names of their ancestors for 50 generations back. Have any of you watched the movie or read the book Roots by Alex Haley? Okay, so few of you are nodding your heads. Roots is now, the movie is 40 years old. I saw the movie, but I was advised don't pay attention to the movie. It's a Hollywood makeover. I know, but anyway, Alex Haley went back to Africa, looked up his tribal people and got some of their history and found out what had happened to his ancestor, which had been passed down by way of word of mouth from generation to generation. And he got a history of what had happened to his ancestor 300 or so years before, 350, 400 years before, and he wrote about it in his book. All right, again, a lot of the history is passed down. History is being reconstructed. A lot of their history is archaeology. We dig up their old buildings. We also look at their artwork. They've left behind a whole lot of artwork and study their trails, their iron smelting places, their mines, their tin mines, iron mines, gold mines, and eventually slowly reconstruct a history. We know a lot more about African history than we did 50 years ago and 51 years ago when I was a freshman in college and started learning African history. I read the chapter on African history twice. What your book says today is a little bit different in it. We know more about it than we did then. All right. First kingdom we'll talk about. Now, these are the civilized people we're going to talk about first. The kingdom of Kush. Kush, now what's confusing, some of these places were called one name and then turned around and they were called another name. Kush was later called Nubia. Now, the name Kush is believed by a lot of scholars that come from the biblical name Cush. Cush was a grandson of Noah. You had Noah, his son Ham, and Ham had a son named Cush. And the Cushites are believed to be descended from Cush, settled in the northwest corner of Africa, just south of Egypt. Now, they may have been civilized before Egypt was, or they may have been civilized after, or they may have started becoming civilized at the same time. Egypt and Cush had a lot in common with each other. They both of them had writing that looks alike. Unfortunately, we cannot decipher the Cush writing because we don't have enough of it. Now, if someday we find a big library with a big cache of a lot of writing, we'll be able to decipher it. But until that day comes, we cannot read their writing. They also built pyramids, but unlike the Egyptian pyramids, the pyramids of Cush were only about 6 to 8 feet tall, nothing large like the ones in Egypt. Now, the Cushites learned to farm, and again, we don't know who came first, the Egyptians or the Cushites. But some people believe that Cush were the first people to learn to farm, and they taught farming to their neighbors, who in turn taught it to the rest of humanity. Farming involves both growing tame plants and animals. Tame animals like sheep and cattle, and tame plants like the plants you plant in the ground to eat. Now, Cush is a tropical country, which means you can plant any time of the year and harvest whenever you're ready to. But there is one problem with it, though. There are all kinds of parasites, all kinds of bugs that will get in the way, or some of them are microscopic germs that will destroy plant life, and some of this lives on the ground. Parasites you don't have in the more temperate climates where there's a winter. No winter means that certain parasites can grow. Something else too. Again, we have never seen this in this country that I know of. You look out one day and there's a small little red, like reddish cloud, and you know it's not a storm cloud. You know what's coming is a cloud of locusts. The locusts will come in and they will take every bit of plant life away, anything smaller than your wrist. They saw up and destroy and devour until everything green is gone. Then when they're through, they'll fly off and go damage some other place where they find some greenery. This, again, is something we can't imagine, but what the natives would sometimes do is go out and kill the locusts as best they could and start eating the locusts. The locusts are edible, but it was either that or starve. But they would get the locusts, put them in a bag, wrap them up, and then throw the bag in some hot boiling water, and that would, of course, take care of that part of the locust. They couldn't kill them all. Now today we have sprays, but again, sprays are sometimes considered environmentally harmful. But they had problems with this back then. Nubia and Egypt would trade with each other. Egypt conquered Nubia and held it for a while. Then Nubia broke away, and as is the case sometimes, eventually Nubia conquered Kish. And Egypt actually had a black dynasty. One of the dynasties was black, Nubian. The Assyrians, I told you I'd mention the Assyrians again. Well, the Assyrians came down and they drove the Nubians out of Egypt and restored another dynasty to Egypt. And Cush then became a trading center. Again, what did Africa have to offer to trade? The answer is a whole lot. They traded with Rome during the Roman days. And what did they trade? Their trade involved ivory, iron, gold, ebony, and slaves. I had a student in this morning's class ask, what about diamonds? I really don't know if diamonds were found in Africa before the 1880s or not, but I do know that about the 1870s or 1880s, Africa became a land that produced a lot of diamonds. Ivory came from elephants, and today we have outlawed the ivory trade, even though I hear it goes on in the black market. Piano keyboards used to be made out of ivory. Today we have synthetic material that works just as well. And iron, Africa has more of than any place on earth. I want to say this about the iron. We have found that the Africans did learn how to melt iron. And folks, now again, don't ever try this. But to melt iron, you've got to get a super really hot fire. And the only way to get the fire hot is to throw oxygen on it. And in those days, they used big bellows. I mean, bellows that were as big as tall as a man. And they would pump the oxygen. I mean, several men would get around the fire and pump oxygen into the bellows and get the fire hot enough to melt the iron. And as the iron melted, I'm talking about iron ore that was pulled from the ground, the impurities would tend to float on top. Now, again, if you know anything about chemistry, when you have a liquid involved, anything heavier than the liquid will go to the bottom. Anything lighter than liquid will float to the top. So then it'd go around with shovels that were made out of clay, You might ask why clay? Well, because the pots that melt the iron were made out of clay. Clay would not melt when the iron did. They go around with clay shovels and scrape the impurities off the top of the iron. What was left was pure iron, except maybe some of the heavier stuff might have gone to the bottom. Then they would take this iron and pour it out into a mold while still hot. They'd have to use special tools, of course, to do that. They pour it into a mold and make it into whatever shape they wanted to. But anyway, Africa was the world's leading producer of iron, and some of their smelting places are not still in service. We have better ways of doing that today. We have electric pumps that pump the oxygen into the iron, which they didn't have. But once the iron was melted down and the impurities removed, the iron was ready to be shipped out, shipped to places like Europe. Possibly Carthage, which I'm talking about. Carthage was the gateway, believed by some to be the gateway that led to sub-Saharan Africa. Now again, if you go to Independence, Missouri, you'll be told that that was the gateway to the American West many years ago. And then, of course, if you go to St. Louis, Missouri, on the other side of Missouri, you'll be told the same thing, that St. Louis was really the gateway to the West. The railroad line used to end at St. Louis. Then it ended at Independence on the other side of the state. And eventually, though, after the Civil War, the railroad went all the way to the West Coast. Now, to get across the desert, donkeys were used at first, but then camels were used. And when the camel came into use, trade became a whole lot more. Donkeys could handle the situation before the desert got large. I'm going to talk about this later. Sahara Desert started out fairly small, folk, and got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it still is expanding at the rate of about 20 or 30 miles every year. And we wonder how much more can it expand, but we really don't know. Again, these people, I told you earlier, they had a hieroglyphic type script. They eventually developed alphabetic writing, copying the rest of the world, but their alphabetic writing has not been deciphered either. We have a few stone inscriptions which we cannot read because we don't have enough of them. All right. A lot of trade involved with the Cushites, trading with the rest of the world. Now, Axum. Again, have another name for Axum. Axum is also known as Ethiopia, which still exists today. At first, Axum was part of the kingdom of Saba. Saba is in Arabia. Your book suggests that Saba is the biblical Sheba. Now, I want to elaborate on that a little bit. According to the biblical account, the Queen of Sheba heard how rich Solomon was, so she got together a large caravan, a great train of camels that carried a lot of spices and wealth. And she went to visit Solomon, and she was very much impressed with Solomon's wealth. According to, not the biblical account, but according to what the Ethiopians have told us, Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a son named Menelik, and this son became the ancestor of a long line of Ethiopian kings that lasted until 1974, when the last was overthrown. The last Ethiopian king was Haile Selassie. Again, that name might mean nothing to you, but he was leader of one of the most powerful men in Africa when I was young. And finally, Haile Selassie was overthrown and the communists took over. But anyway, there was a long line of kings, and they kept their history like others did orally, word of mouth, from generation to generation. There is also a story, and this has created a lot of speculation, that the Ark of the Covenant was stolen by Menelik, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, that he stole the Ark of the Covenant and carried it to Ethiopia, and it's there to this day, which is why it can't be found. Apparently, the Catholic Church believed this because Italy tried to conquer Ethiopia in the 1890s and lost. Now I want to mention, Ethiopia has two things going for it militarily. One is some fairly steep mountains that they know how to navigate and no outside army has learned it. And number two is the book won't mention, that they have a whole lot of venomous snakes that terrify invading armies, and yet the Ethiopians themselves do not seem to be afraid of them. I'm not going to try to explain why that is, but armies that try to invade Ethiopia have generally come to ruin. But anyway, Italy tried to invade Ethiopia in the 1890s. The British, now I must state this, the British gave the Ethiopians better weapons than the Italian army had. So Ethiopia went into the battle with heavy artillery and high quality rifles, the best rifles at that time that were given to them by the British, and they stopped the Ethiopians. And oh, it was terribly, they stopped the Italians. It was terribly embarrassing to Italy, because Italy became the only European country to ever be defeated by an African country. Terribly embarrassing. So in the 1930s, Italy went back under Mussolini. This time they won. Italy had planes and tanks, Ethiopia had none. But Italy did not get to keep its prize for long. Italy took the opposite side of us during World War II, and when Italy lost World War II, they had to give Ethiopia its independence again. So Ethiopia's conquest was short-lived. But now in Ethiopia, that's one reason why a lot of people are interested today, there's a group of black people who claim to be Jews, and they are the only people who claim to be descended from the Jewish Levitical priesthood. That they are the ones who supposedly are taking care of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if the Ark does exist in Ethiopia, the big question is where is it located? Nobody outside knows. All right. There's been movies. Well, the most famous movie about the Ark is called Raiders of the Lost Ark. Some of you might have seen the movie where the Ark found its way into an American warehouse and was still there, forgotten about and lost. Anyway, that's the story. All right. Now, in the 300s, Ethiopia adopted Christianity. They adopted a form of Christianity called Coptic Christianity, which was the Christianity of the Egyptians. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about what Coptic Christianity is. It has to do with they believe differently about the nature of the Godhead more than other Christians do. They believe different from what other Christians do. But Egypt was Coptic, and Ethiopia then became Coptic also. Where this becomes important in the story is the Coptic Christians were persecuted by the other Christians, and they were glad when Islam came out and they actually helped Islam conquer Egypt. But Ethiopia proved a different matter. When Islam came to Ethiopia, Ethiopia and Islam fought long, long wars in which Islam could not win. Again, owing to two things, the mountains, and I personally think venomous snakes also. But I don't know about any of you, but I'm terrified of snakes, especially the kind that have rounded tails and slit eyes, if you know what I mean. If you're in North America, if you can look at a snake's eyes, they're slit. If they're slit, they're poisonous. If they have rounded tails instead of pointed tails, they're venomous. Generally, venomous snakes are fatter than non-venomous snakes for their length. They have more muscle than the non-venomous snakes do. All right. Leaving Ethiopia for a while, the Sahara. During the last ice age, it is believed that every European practically came south, crossed the Mediterranean, and lived in what is today the Sahara Desert. Because Europe was completely covered over with ice, particularly the mountains of Europe, the northern parts of Europe. The Mediterranean Sea is actually known to have frozen over during the Ice Age. We don't know how long it stayed frozen, but the Mediterranean Sea froze. But the Sahara Desert was somewhat warm. The Sahara Desert this time was not a desert. It had a whole lot of grasslands. And again, when I talk about African grass, I'm talking about tall grass. But this grassland was great for game. We know how the people lived by their artwork. They left behind their paintings. And yes, in the desert, the dry desert, paintings can last for more than 1,000 years, still be decipherable. They also left behind their statues when they left. And again, these people leave behind their statues. Even wooden statues can last for more than 1,000 years in that dry desert. These people had a lot of game, probably wild beasts and elk and animals related to the deer, but a lot of game. Now, folk, there have been people who have theorized the Sahara Desert started becoming a desert because when the rain stopped, the people resorted to irrigation, but the water that they pulled up from the ground, if they pulled up from their ponds and their lakes and their fountains, contained a lot of salt. And if you know anything about your chemistry, when salt water evaporates, the salt is left behind. So they'd water their crops with water that had, not pure ocean water, but water that had more salt than it should have had. The plants would grow at first, but after a while the soil would become saltier and saltier. And then the soil started drying up, and as the soil dried up, the sun beat down on it and created a whole lot of hot temperatures. And this in turn made the desert larger and larger, and the desert is still getting larger to this day. And the people living there had to abandon it. Well, by this time things had warmed up, so a lot of the Europeans went back to Europe. I mean, some of this is speculation. But the desert then became a trade route to where camel caravans would go from one oasis to another. Your book shows the map of the trade routes, and I had an Asian man once ask me, why didn't they go in a straight line? I said, they had to follow the oasis. They had to learn where the water holes were and where the ponds and lakes were. So they would follow the oasis. Now, by traveling in caravans, this helped them fight off robbers for one thing, and thieves, because thieves became a real problem in this wild desert country. So they would get together in large caravans, and when the outlaw band saw how big the caravan was, they'd leave them alone because, hey, these people outnumber us. And your book suggests that the caravan trade might have brought the knowledge of iron smelting to the South African people. When the camel was introduced, that greatly increased trade across Sahara, and that was especially true as the Sahara Desert got bigger and bigger. All right. East Africa. Land of the Zanj. Z-A-N, J, Z-A-N-J. Monsoon winds the monsoon winds would blow in one direction for 6 months, blow east. Then the winds would change direction, spend 6 months blowing west. This meant that a ship captain knew what he was doing, could get from Africa to the Far East pretty quickly, and then get home fairly quickly also, all within a year's time. Now, word reminder, some of you might know this already, a sailboat